Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Edward Park, and I'm a professor at Loyola Marymount University. And it's once again my pleasure to address all of you in a most unconventional way this time. I usually love the stage, and but here we are behind our computer cameras here. Let's see. Very important information is my email address below, and it's just been a great pleasure of mine to exchange emails with the teacher participants over the years. And folks have asked me questions, provided additional information. I actually wrote a couple of job recommendation letters, and so it's been a fantastic experience for me to meet you and get to know all of you. As was mentioned, my job today is to walk you through Korean immigration history, and this will have a pretty profound, ramification for approaching Korean history, right? We all understand that immigration history begins with the history of the sending nation. But that means that we get a very sort of selective slice of Korean history. But with that sort of qualification, let me go and get started. Okay, and so let's see. All right. I'm sure that all of you have seen the map of Korea when you are a little boy, like I was in South Korea until I was 10. When you do your Korean history, you understand two things. One is that Korean peninsula looks like a rabbit. And number two, that Korean history is fraught with all these tragedies and national calamities, and it hasn't been sort of the easiest history. And that has a lot to do with this idea that Korea is caught between the whales. And like a more elaboration is that Korea is a shrimp caught between the whales. And if you look at Korea's geography, what you see is that it sits right at the nexus of China, Japan, and Russia. Three civilizational powers that oftentimes looked upon poor Korea as a land bridge to project their power or to extend their power. For my purposes, another very important aspect of Korea's geography is that Korea lies at the very end of the modern world system, right? And so if we're talking about global history or world history, what we know is that Europe woke up from its dark ages after the plague, something we're living through. I really hope we have this flowering of civilization after what we're going through today, but let's see. But anyway, the idea is that Europe woke from its dark ages and it began to spread outward, right? And it began to colonize or project imperial power or establish trade routes centered in Europe and incorporating various parts of the world. What is interesting is if you trace that process, East Asia happens to be one of the last places in which this kind of imperial domination comes to, spreads around the world, right? And so one of the most interesting things about Korea's contact with this macro system of imperialism and globalization during this particular period is that by the time it comes to the Korean peninsula, it'll in fact be Japan who opens up Korea into the world systems after it becomes a developed country on its own right. And then one of the countries that was a colony of Great Britain, namely the United States, will play a leading role in incorporating Korea into the modern global system. And so like the cast of characters differ, right? And so while in other parts of the country, it's like Great Britain and Spain and Portugal that are implicated in their story of opening up, in the case of Korea, it'll be countries like Japan and the United States. And of course, that brings us up into the Korean American story, because the United States will be such an important part of that process, right? And so when we begin with Korea is this era of gunboat diplomacy, right? And so many of you know that all of these countries around the world were forced to open up by Western powers at the threat of the gunboat, right, invading these countries. That's what it's called, the gunboat diplomacy. And in Korea, one of the first countries that it had this encounter with was the United States itself. And so in 1871, what happened was American merchant ships sailed into Han River, trying to establish trade with Korea. Korea at the time was in a period of isolation. And what they did was they promptly sank these American merchant ships. And so the American government became very, very angry. And they sent the Marines in 1871 to punish these Koreans. And number of villages were sacked, number of Korean lives were lost. And America decided that negotiating with Koreans and opening up this country isn't worth it. So they will turn their attention to Japan. And we all know that that the United States had a great big role in opening up of Japan, with Commodore Perry sailing into Edo Bay and Japan going through its Meiji Restoration. Okay. After the failure on the part of the United States to establish diplomatic mission in Korea, it would be up to Japan to open Korea up. And Japan, suffered no delusion that Korea would open up its doors and accept Japanese, with civility and with amity. And so in 1875, at the threat of more military punitive actions, Japan sailed into Gwangha Island and forced Koreans to sign the Gwangha Treaty of 1875. What the Gwangha Treaty of 1875 did was it opened up Korea to Japanese merchants, and it allowed Japanese to establish businesses, send immigrants. Japanese could live in Korea to pursue economic interests. Japanese could own land, and so on. So after Japan signs this unequal treaty that heretofore were like the thing that the Western powers did, what happens is other powers also sail into Korea and demand equal treatment, right? And back in those days, the idea of an equal treatment meant, well, Korea signed an unequal treaty with Japan, so we Americans want the same kind of privileges from you, right? And so the Korean-American Treaty was signed in 1882. And this was when I graduated from high school, way back when. And that was, 1982, and not 1882, 1982. And I remember when I graduated from high school, all the Korean youth in the country got this very nice book commemorating 100-year anniversary between Korea and the United States. All right. What happens in the Korean Peninsula, though, is that Japan is not just interested in being one of many powers that hold sway over Korea, right? Japan's ultimate idea is to use Korea, incorporate it within its nation-state system, and use Korea as a land bridge for their further adventure into Russia and China. And Japan has this vision of becoming this great big imperial power, right? What that does immediately is that it thrusts Korean Peninsula into wars, right? And the Sino-Japanese War is fought between China and Japan over the how would I put this, over ending this kind of older brother China, younger brother Korea sojournary relationship between these two countries, right? And so basically Japan is pushing China out of the Korean Peninsula, and the Chinese and Koreans had a very sort of special relationship because Korea always saw China as a source of their like civilization. And so, and this is for those of us, for those of you who know Asian history, this is a big deal, right? Japan, a very younger brother with respect to China, defeats China in this war. Now, before Japan drives out the Russians from the Korean Peninsula, there's a very important story that opens the door for Korean immigration to the United States and to Hawaii. And the story revolves around this medical doctor named Horace Allen. And Horace Allen was a missionary and a medical doctor. And if you believe in fate of individual lives, it's a pretty wild story. And that is, Horace Allen was visiting the royal court. Queen's favorite nephew is ill. He cures him, and he becomes an advisor to the king. And Horace Allen's idea is that Korea is going to become Japanese colony, and for Korea to have any chance at winning back their freedom or their independence is to send Korean immigrants to places like Hawaii and the United States so that they could agitate for Korea's independence, right? Into this like country that will, you know, eventually become very powerful, and that is, of course, the United States. So it's in fact a handful of individuals that play a very important role in shipping Koreans off from the Korean Peninsula into Hawaii's sugar plantations and into the farms of the west coast of the United States. And Dr. Horace Allen is a very, very important figure in that. Horace Allen also brings like Western medicine, and Yonsei University's medical school is named after him, as well as these big hospitals. And so if you go to Korea, you'll see his name all over the place. All right, so pivoting off of Horace Allen, Japan continues its kind of ruthless march toward colonization of Korea. Russo-Japanese War is fought, and Japanese defeat the Russians and their humongous navy. Teddy Roosevelt, negotiates the peace, and so he wins this Nobel Peace Prize. But it, I think, emboldens the Japanese, because Japanese think, Americans have a tacit approval of their imperial agenda, which in fact Americans do. And in short order, Japan makes Korea a protectorate, meaning that while Koreans have the nominal power within its own borders, Japan makes, foreign policy and hold levers of power over the Korean Peninsula in other ways. Now, Japan dispenses with all of these niceties, all of these optics about being an imperial power, and just grabs Korea through the Annexation Treaty of 1910. So in 1910, Korea ceases to be an independent country. Koreans are not Korean citizens anymore. There is no country of Korea. And Koreans become so-called the emperor's people, and they are now entirely the wards of the Japanese government. However, in between those developments, what happens is the Protectorate Treaty means that Japan now gets to make foreign policy. One of the things that the Japanese government does as soon as Korea becomes a protectorate is to pass an exclusion order that says Koreans can no longer immigrate to Hawaii and to the United States, right? Why? Because Koreans are causing a lot of trouble for the Japanese government in Hawaii and in the United States because they're agitating for Korea's independence. I think the other kind of interest is that, like, Japan is obviously on a course of industrialization and militarization, and they probably figured that they could use these Korean workers themselves. Okay? So in Korea, in the United States and in Korea, what happens is there is a existential struggle for the future of Korea, right? And Korea is nation no more, and it falls onto a handful of political activists to try and win Korea's independence. The three young men here that you see in this photo all have that vision in mind, right? Korea should be an independent country. But the way in which the Koreans are divided is really profound, and it's over like the tactics of it. So the Seungman Rhee is here. He will later become the first president of South Korea, and he headed what was called a diplomatic faction. And he thought what Koreans could do in America is to lobby the US government to challenge Japan and bring Korea's independence, which in fact is what happened. The other person here is Park Young-man, and he was a young man who thought that Koreans should not rely on the United States, that they should fight and win the independence on their own, right? Because he felt that if other powers won their independence for them, that there would be a political cost to be paid later on, right? My favorite horse in this race is this man, An Chang-ho. I have a picture here. And this is a picture of me. I visited Korea just over last November. And that is actually a statue of An Chang-ho. And this is the Gangnam district, the district that Psy made famous. And there's an An Chang-ho Park there. And the vision that An Chang-ho had, and which makes him my favorite Korean patriot, is because he felt that that Korean Americans should pursue like equal rights in America, and that Korean Americans would be in America for the long haul. They weren't just going to be exiles, and that to be an effective Korean in the world, they needed to achieve a measure of equality in America itself. And so he preached things like racial justice from very early on. And so there he is, okay? All right, a little bit about the lives of Korean Americans living in the United States. And for those of you who are familiar with Asian American history, all of this stuff is gonna be pretty familiar, right? And that is when the Koreans immigrated to the United States, beginning in 1903, in the mainland, most of them were incorporated into migrant farm work and tenant farming, right? US obviously was a very much an agrarian country. And so they joined the Chinese and Japanese in working the land. Now, what happens is that because United States has a very good diplomatic relationship with Japan, up until about the 1920s, right? And then things will fall apart after that. But before that period, what United States government did was to agree to treat Koreans like Japanese, right? And one of the things that allowed Koreans to do that Chinese could not do or the Filipinos could not do was to bring picture brides, right? So Korean farmers could, through exchange of pictures, marry a woman in Korea, send for their wives, and Koreans could now have families and ordinary communities. This was an incredibly important privilege for Asian immigrants because apart from the Japanese and Koreans, other groups could not have that opportunity, right? And because of the laws, they could not marry whites, which meant that for groups like the Chinese and Filipinos, they would have like bachelor societies, right? And the population would plummet. Okay. Now, Koreans, along with Japanese, because of their family-based economy, were able to own land here in California, and many became independent farmers very quickly, and some of them became very successful farmers. But what this does is it causes a backlash. And here in California, as a number of other states in the West and the Southwest, state governments passed a law called the Alien Land Act. But despite its name, it did not just prohibit immigrants from owning land, right? If you know your like Italian American history, like Italians thrived as farmers. And so what it did was it used this language called aliens ineligible to citizenship, right? That's a pretty convoluted language. What's that mean? It means that that state of California made a distinction between one group of foreigner versus another group of foreigner, right? And so if you were a white immigrant, you were an alien eligible to citizenship. Therefore, you could own land, build an agricultural empire in Central Valley. But if you were Japanese or Korean, then you were foreigner who could not become citizens. And many of you might think, what's that? What's that mean? Well, it means that under the Naturalization Act of 1790, only whites could become citizens, right? And subsequent groups would have other laws that would allow them to become citizens. But as you'll find out, Koreans could not become citizens until 1952, which is quite recent, even though some of my students think that that was like ancient history. All right. This citizenship question comes to a Korean man named Isak Emson Char. And what happened with Emson Char, a Korean man, by this time he had a family. He had his wife, 2 children. And Emson Char, believe it or not, served in World War I. He was a doughboy, right? He worked in Hawaii, he worked in California, he ended up in the Midwest, graduated from college, and then served as a medic during World War I. And under the law, war veterans could become citizens. And so he became a citizen. But unfortunately, United States government stripped him of his citizenship because as a non-white and as an Asian, he could not become a US citizen. So he was stripped of his citizenship, and his wife faced a deportation order to colonial Korea, meaning back to Japan, where she would have been severely punished for engaging in these independent activities. Now, for Koreans, their immigration to the United States would come to an end. Even these political refugees could no longer enter the United States because in 1924, the National Origins Act of the United States stipulated that aliens who are ineligible to citizenship cannot enter the United States, right? And so given the times, I think we kind of understand like, oh, African Americans faced slavery. Native Americans and Mexican Americans, faced conquest in a very profound and deep way. Asians then faced exclusion, right? We had a federal law that stipulated, based solely on race, these people could not immigrate to the United States. Now, so the idea here is that the independence movement, the movement among Korean Americans to agitate, to bring Korea political independence, becomes monumentally important, right? Because their path to American citizenship and American inclusion is closed off, right? And so independence movement is a sort of a movement that galvanizes the community and captures their imagination. All right. Korea would gain their independence from Japan, but they would not do so because these Koreans would, go to China and push the Japanese out. They would gain their independence because of World War II. United States drops 2 atomic bombs in Japan. Japan surrenders unconditionally, and they give up their colonial possessions, including Korea. So in that sense, Sungman Rhee was right. Korea was too weak to gain independence. It took a global power to deliver that. But then Park Young-man was right also, because the price of Korean independence through the big powers was the division of Korea between North and South, right? All right. Now, for Koreans, what happens is that national division results in the Korean War that was fought over 3 years with profound and tragic cost to Korean society. And at the height of America's Cold War, the United States government passes the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. What this does is a very interesting thing. Korean War is pursued by the United States by using Japan as a base, right? And so American Air Force is able to use Japan as a base to attack North Korea, drop all these bombs, and then safely come back. And so in order to reward Japan for their alliance with the United States and the pursuit of the Korean War, the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 allows the Japanese to become citizens of the United States, right? And also gives them the right to immigrate to the US. And US government policy, like I said, was to treat Koreans like the Japanese. And amazingly, this in fact holds true even after the Second World War. And so Koreans are able to become citizens, and they're able to send 130 immigrants to the United States with the passage of the McCarran-Walter Act. What it does in one profound way is that it relieves the Koreans of this weight of de jure or legally sanctioned racism, right? And Koreans could now become citizens. They're no longer subject to alien land acts, and are able to have a measure of legal equality in the United States. Okay. Let me just show you a couple of pictures. That is our man here of the hour, Emson Char. He lied about his age. He came to Hawaii at the age of 14 and worked as a plantation worker. Eventually worked hard and made it to Park College in Missouri and became, he graduated from college and so on, right? After his citizenship was denied, a sympathetic congressman sponsored and passed a single law that allowed him and his family to stay in America, okay? Now, today we tend to think about Koreans as really a suburban population and maybe urban population as well. But historically, Koreans were very much a rural population, and their population in the mainland was centered in Central Valley. And so whenever I take my kids off to college at Berkeley and we have to go drive on that Highway 5, every time I pass a city, I'm like, I keep telling my kids that, oh, you know, there was a Korean community here, and they're sick and tired of me saying that all the time. But the truth of the matter is that Koreans were a very, very modest immigrant group, you know, and here in California, their fate was really tied to agriculture, and very tragically, set of laws prohibited them from achieving the kind of success I think they would have otherwise. Okay, so at this point, why don't I turn it over to Ginny, and then the poll quiz. Okay.
So we'll give a few seconds for participants to answer.
All right.
Professor Park, do you see the poll results also as people are answering? Okay, good.
Uh-huh.
And if you'd like, you can also take a look at the chat box. There had been just some comments, some questions.
Okay, let me see.
If you see like more button.
Right, there we go.
And then chat.
Yes.
Yeah, and I could also throughout keep my eye out. I'll keep like a list of the questions in case you can't keep track. I can help.
Okay, great. Are we? So are we done with the? Oh no, we have to wait for 100%.
So sometimes not everyone can answer because of technical difficulties. You can start to talk about it. Yeah, okay. Let's get started on talking about the results.
I see. Well, I think a vast majority of the people have answered, you know, correctly. So this was really great. Yeah. Uh-huh. But right. Horace Allen was a medical doctor. And then Japan defeated Russia to gain control over Korea. And the Naturalization Act of 1790 declared that only whites could become citizens, right? All right, so let me get into the lecture. I want to make sure that we get through all of it. Okay, and so let's see. Oh, where am I? Yikes. Okay. All right, so the passage of the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 is a nice place to end this first wave of the Korean American experience, right? And what we understand is that there were these like formal and legally sanctioned system of discrimination that really limited the lives and the possibilities for Korean Americans. Now, the contemporary Korean immigration is an immigration story that I think could be broken into two stages, into two parts. And so what happens in the United States after the Second World War? The idea here is the United States after the Second World War goes into this period of civil rights movement, right? All the African-American GIs come back to the United States. They find that they fought for these rights and privileges in Europe that they themselves did not have in the United States. And of course, I'm sure all of you are familiar with that history. And one of the great achievements of the civil rights movement is the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965, right? And the Immigration Act of 1965 is bookended by Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968. And these four laws try and eliminate the referencing of race in American civic life. And the Immigration Act of 1965 then gets rid of all the mentions in US immigration policy that linked how foreigners enter the United States based largely upon their racial and ethnic stock, right? And so for the first time since 1882, when the Chinese were excluded, American immigration law becomes racially blind. I guess that I could have just said that right off the bat. So there's no racial referencing anymore. How are we admitting foreigners into the United States? Well, we do that through two paths. One is through family reunification, and that is Immigration Act of 1965 says, well, the job of immigration law should be to reunite families that's been divided, right? A controversial interpretation of this provision, which is probably very true, is that family reunification was used to try and guarantee the dominance of European stock of immigration flow, right? And so since the Europeans were the ones who were immigrating in the 1920s and 30s, the idea was that it would continue that pattern by emphasizing family reunification. However, the other way in which family immigrants could enter the United States was that if you were a skilled worker, and even unskilled worker, but the American economy had sectors that needed immigrant workers, then people could immigrate, right? The profile of immigrants that the 1965 Immigration Act generated for Koreans were the following, and that is from 1968, when the immigration law went into effect, and up until 1990, when a new immigration law, I think, profoundly altered immigration flow, the kind of Koreans who were immigrating to the United States were made up of, like, in my lecture, I wrote down three qualities. One is they were traditional immigrants, meaning that Koreans who immigrated between 1968 to 1990 were people who came to the United States with this idea that they will live in America permanently, that they would die in America, that immigration was by and large a one-way door, and through immigration they were, right, betting their lives that it'll work out in America, right? The second idea here is that most Korean immigrants during this time who were drawn from the big cities like Seoul and Busan, Daegu, and Korean immigration during this time drew heavily from middle-class professionals in South Korea. The expectations were that Korean immigrants would come to the United States, and initially they would experience this kind of downward mobility, right? And so when I was growing up in the Korean community in Southern California, all the Korean immigrant adults that I knew were, people like doctors and lawyers or teachers in Korea, but they were working as like janitors, liquor store owners, and other low-income wage jobs. But the idea was that immigrant generation would suffer, but their children would be educated in America, and that mobility in America would be a multi-generational kind of process, right? And finally, because of the family reunification provisions of the Immigration Act, it was the immigration of a family unit. And immigration data shows that, during this time, by and large, Koreans immigrated as intact family units, right? Throwing caution and their fate into the wind to try and make, find success in America. And then also this idea that because immigration was a long-term process, that the understanding was, if the older generation experienced downward mobility, that was all a part of this overall strategy, that they would sacrifice themselves for the mobility of their children in the future, right? What happens with the Immigration Act of 1965 is that by the 1980s, American society becomes very unhappy with the resulting immigration flows, right? And the reason why they're unhappy is because, by and large, because of the emphasis on family reunification, the class and educational background of immigrants begin to decline, right? And, there's all these sociological reasons for it, but I won't get into it at this point here. The important idea here is that the United States government passes the Immigration Act of 1990, right? And the Immigration Act of 1990 decides that what we should do is, instead of focusing on family members, what we should do is we should give additional consideration for skilled workers and investors to immigrate to the United States, right? And so, all the things that we've been hearing recently about, let's say, the H-1B visa, well, that's the product of the Immigration Act of 1990, right? And that is like, oh, if you're a skilled worker, let's bring you into the United States. You could work for companies like Apple or Microsoft or Google. And then the idea is that once your work is done, maybe you could go back, right? And so the point here is that the Immigration Act of 1990 amends the Immigration Act of 1965. And so instead of having immigrants who are more reflective of the demographics of these sending countries, what we would do is we would privilege skilled workers and investors who could invest in the US economy, right? These are so-called $1 million visas, that if you invest $1 million in American economy, create 10 jobs, then you could get a green card and immigrate to the US. If you are a medical doctor and a fancy engineer, then we could give you a green card and bring you and your family into the US. If you're an engineer and you're not that skilled, then maybe we could give you an H-1B visa so that you could work here, but once your job is done, then you go back. For South Koreans, what happens then is that it profoundly changes the pattern of immigration. And that is, if the prototype 1965 immigrants came to the United States with everything that they own, with their families together, and thought their fate will be decided in Southern California, the profile of the new Koreans that are coming in after 1990 might be one or two members of the family coming to the United States, maybe even temporarily, or maybe to look for investment opportunities. And that their migration to the United States might not be permanent. It might be temporary. It might be strategic, right? And so maybe the idea here is that instead of thinking about their immigration to the United States as a one act that is permanent, what if I bring the kids, enroll them in American high schools, and they go to college, and then once their college is done, we go back to Korea, right? And there are just millions of different permutations about that. So as somebody who's been doing this for a while, one of the things that I've been hearing about over and over is this idea that, you know, immigrants today, we're not so sure if they are completely committed to America, right? Maybe they have their one leg in America and another leg in Korea. My response always then is this idea that if that is true, it's because our US law has changed, right? We, in fact, have favored and tilted the table towards people who are looking to migration as a strategic, temporary decision rather than a kind of an existential decision or a permanent decision that they're coming to America to become Americans, right? And so it's been interesting to see that on both of those ends. So with these two immigration laws, I think the face of Korean immigrants are understandably reflected in all of those multiple ways, right? And so like the three images that I wanted to share with you is, on the one hand, this is a photograph of a protest. And it's a protest held by the Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance. And this is a organization that represents low-wage Korean workers, right, who immigrated to the United States from a more modest background. They are sort of almost trapped in the Korean ethnic economy that pay low wages, provide very little in the way of benefits, and they're sort of eking out and grinding out a living in places like Koreatown, LA, or Koreatown in Garden Grove. And if you have people like that, you also have the new headquarters, the Samsung building in San Jose, in the heart of Silicon Valley, right? And Samsung is one of the most powerful corporations in the world. That Samsung building alone is bringing well over 2,000 Korean engineers and executives and mid-level managers who's in the United States temporarily, right? And so San Jose now has these great Korean restaurants and barbecue joints and stuff, but the Koreans who are there are a little bit different than the Koreans who might be in Los Angeles because they're there on a temporary basis. They're there because South Korea is now a great big power economically, and Samsung is able to bring their workforce with them, right? And then the final image here is that of council member David Liu, right? And so I know that Professor Susie Wu is going to talk about the Los Angeles civil unrest of 1992. After that monumentally significant event, Koreans just went on this path to try and find a political voice in the city of Los Angeles. But it took them a very, very long time, but they did it, right? And so now it's been already like maybe 6 years ago, I guess. David Liu became the first Korean American to serve on Los Angeles City Council, the only second Asian American to serve on LA City Council. And the election of David Liu into LA's City Hall represents for Korean Americans, especially those of us who maybe come from the 1965 Immigration Act, a very, very powerful, right, symbol of Koreans like laying down their roots, right? The point here is that realities like the Samsung corporate campuses show that Korean immigration experience now has become ever more complicated, kind of two paths of traditional immigrant experience and this kind of transnational experience, okay? Maybe the best way to do this is should we do the poll now, or should I just get through and then do the rest of the questions at the same time?
I'll leave it up to you. So again, we have this poll and then the last poll.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we can just go through.
Okay.
So take good notes, everybody. All right. The next set of slides I could go through quickly because I think these are just empirical data that I wanted to share with you. And once again, use the Korean immigration experience as a long-term sort of approach to Korean history. Now, this is a very interesting figure, that chart, that maps the number of Koreans who are immigrating to the US. These are the green card holders, new green card holders that's happening. The line at the bottom is the GDP per capita of South Korea. And the reason why it is so low here is because Korea was so poor in 1970, right? Korea was poorer than all of the Southeast Asian countries, even some countries in Africa. The big story of Korea, of course, is this incredible economic rise. The immigration pattern also is very interesting because when Korea was very poor, the immigration to the United States was like on a rocket ship. Now, once Korea reached a certain income level, what happens is the Korean immigration declines rapidly. Now, many people who were studying Korean immigration thought that this would be over, that Korean numbers would continue to go down. But alas, it recovered. Hang on one second.
All right, and thank you everyone for the questions in the chat room. I have a feeling we will not have enough time to get to the questions. So like I said in the chat, I will be sure to forward the questions to him.
All right, great. You know, one of the things that I'm realizing as I'm teaching at home is that the most important resource I have at school at LMU is silence, right? I just never realized it's so noisy during the daytime here, okay? The most intriguing part of this is that even as Korea gets wealthier and wealthier, why do the numbers of immigrants rebound? And I think the big idea here is that this rebound shows that immigration is not just a way to escape poverty, that because of globalization and transnationalism, that there's going to be a certain amount of immigration that reflects this other reality, right? But the peak Korean immigration to the United States happened in the 1980s. And so the lesson here also is that different countries send immigrants over time, but that immigration is not infinite. Country after country, we know that there's a big migration jump. It's stable for a while, but then it declines over time. Okay, and certainly the 80s were the prime time for Korean immigration, right? When new wave music was happening, Koreans were coming to the US. And this is another expression of that here, right? So today, there's 1.6 million Koreans. I think the number will, by this new census, be about almost 2 million, but we'll see. But we'll see. As you could tell, the 1980s, we averaged over 30,000 immigrants a year, but that number is down to anywhere between 15 to 20,000 immigrants come every year now. Okay? All right. This is the geography of Korean Americans living in Southern California. And I know all of you guys, all of you are teachers. And I think this is an incredibly interesting map because the characteristics that connect the population of South Bay to Cerritos to Fullerton, Irvine, Diamond Bar, and La Crescenta is the geography of good public schools in Southern California. And so Korean Americans, more than any ethnic group, follow this geography of education, which is a very interesting idea. The other pockets of Koreans are in Koreatown, and Garden Grove here, which are part of the ethnic labor market. So the idea that ethnic labor market predicts where immigrants settle is not new. And that's true of all the recently arrived immigrants. But what is very fascinating is that Korean obsession over schools is borne out in their geographic distribution, which makes Koreans relatively unique. Maybe the other group where this is that pronounced would be Asian Indians in Southern California. Okay, so why don't I end here because I know that time is over. And Ginny, did you want
to? Would you like for me to share the poll?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the second poll. There's 3 questions. And by the way, I know that many of you are having trouble accessing this poll. That should be a pop-up. So like I said in the chat, I uploaded the document that has all the questions and the multiple choices in the webinar folder. The same folder as where all the slides are located.
Okay. And then I'm done with all the slides, so you could do the
okay, thank you.
Poll as well.
Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, Professor Park, would it be okay that I forward you the questions that were asked in the chat?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I didn't teach last semester because I was on sabbatical. So over the summer, I've been teaching first time in my life online. And I really realized that I'm really a face cue person that I really rely on, on the audience to kind of keep me going. It's really odd to be teaching online and looking at the camera and so on. So sorry for going over my time.
That's okay. So it looks like about 32 of you answered. And Professor, would you say this is the correct answer for number 4, the Immigration Act of 1965? Correct answer is?
Yes, it eliminated racial preferencing, right, in U.S. immigration policy, right? And the favored wealthy immigrants who could, that happens in the 1990 law, right? And the 1990 law, right, increased the number of skilled and wealthy immigrants. And so, and of course, David Liu is the city council member, right?
Right.
Hyunjin Liu is the pitcher for the Dodgers. My daughter thought it was very clever that I said he was a Korean actor in Crazy Rich Asians.
We do have a few minutes, so let me launch the last poll. This only has 2 questions. And again, this is in the same document that I just told you about. Here you go. So it says the first question on here is, since the 1970s, the pattern of Korean immigration to the US?
Right. Yes, the answer is it reached its peak in the 1980s, right? And then the last question, is that the Korean American communities are concentrated around ethnic labor markets and high-performing public schools.
Awesome.
And that's the end.
Yes. Thank you so much. Maybe a round of applause for Dr. Park. 감사합니다.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yes, I look forward to getting your questions, and then I will answer them this afternoon, and I will email it back to Ginny to be shared with everyone else.
That sounds good.
Sounds great.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay,
Dr.
thank
Park.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.